Hello, this is Jason Fields, taking a few minutes to review what responsive web design might mean to us in our current industry in the space of interactive. One of the first things I thought we might want to do is have a quick discussion around what responsive web design is. And really what responsive web design is it's the ability to leverage a single code base and output the same user experience based on the device that's requesting it. What does that mean? Well, first we might want to take a look at what isn't responsive web design. If you are able to see a website on your desktop that looks something like this, and you then go onto your mobile and you see an experience that's like this is not responsive web design. You can see that the visual cues for the brand are not, although they're consistent from a brand perspective, they're not the same from a user experience perspective. So that begs the question, what is responsive web design? Well, this is an example of a website rendered on a desktop with a fairly high resolution. When we move down to a smaller resolution, you'll see that it has the exact same user experience elements, slightly rearranged, so it's scaling well down. And then as you get into something that might reflect more of a tablet experience, you can see again, rearranges the elements, same user experience, same design elements. And then finally, when you get down to a mobile device, it scales very well down to that as well. So the question is, how do they do this? And the idea is around the concept of what we call breakpoints. So what breakpoints are predetermined dimensions or resolutions that the design is going to be able to handle based on what we call resolution definition. When you are able to pick up the resolution of the device that's requesting your web page, you can then, through CSS and HTML, be able to render the appropriate design response to that device. And this is a sampling of both portrait and oriented breakpoints that are of some use to the current device landscape. So where did it come from? Well, it came from a guy named Ethan Marcotte, who published a blog on A List Apart in 2009. And what he talked about was detailing how CSS3 could help HTML structure in responding to different resolutions. But in reality, responsive design has existed almost since the beginning of web design. We just didn't really know it. So kudos to Ethan for figuring it out. And to the authors of CSS3 who have allowed us to really encapsulate it. Just for a quick historical context, HTML standard, the first HTML standard was written in a memo in about 1989, and the first standard was written in 1990. What that means is that we're 23 years into the making of HTML as a language. The CSS wasn't formally adopted until 1994, which is a full 5 years later. So for perspective, if this were the auto industry, HTML would be the Model T, which was built in 1908, and CSS would be the idea of a Model T being offered in different colors. And responsive web design would essentially be a Packard. So you can recognize pretty quickly that we're actually still in the infancy of HTML and CSS, but let's digress a little bit. So back to where did it come from? Well, there's two ways of designing websites from an HTML structure standpoint. One is called a fixed layout, which is where you use pixels or EMs to indicate the width and the height of different elements on the page. And of course, even from the beginning, that was put up against what we call a liquid layout. And what this means is that they don't have fixed dimensions. They have percentages. So it's the liquid that fills the space based on the device that is calling the HTML and CSS files. So what's the debate? Well, from my perspective, the real debate is, does the code efficiency outweigh user and device specificity? And, well, what does that mean? Well, let's take an example. This is a website that is built on responsive design, and it's simple enough on a desktop. I can see it, right? But on a tablet, you can see that the piece of information that I'm interested in drops off below the fold, even in a portrait orientation. But on a mobile, you can see that that same piece of information is much further down on my experience. So if I had interest in a piece of data indicated by the red square here, on a desktop I would be able to see it very quickly. On a tablet I would be able to find it if I decided to scroll, and on a mobile I'd have to scroll 2 or 3 times to get it. So for a simple site like this one, it's not the end of the world, but business rules don't dictate that something should be omnipresent in this particular instance, right? This is just a blog. So what does that really mean? Well, let's take a website that's a little bit more complicated, something like an Emerson College website, where you can see top navigation is able to identify different pieces of content that might be of interest to the user, and then we have the sub-navigation sort of parallel to the logo, where you're allowing the users to identify their own persona, right? You're a student, you're a faculty, you're a parent, etc. If this site were to scale to responsive design, and I just mocked this up, but this is what it might scale like, right? I'm going to take the same navigation structure and I'm going to have it collapse down to a mobile experience, hopefully fairly elegantly and looking a lot better than what I've done here. But people that are on a mobile device aren't coming to emersoncollege.edu for the same reasons that person is coming on the desktop. If I'm coming on a mobile device, I might want directions or a phone number, or I might be looking for an event listing or social connection or a piece of news. But on a mobile device in this responsive model, I can't easily get there. So my experience has been dictated by design instead of my behavior. But if I reject responsive design and can take an approach with behavior in mind rather than design, what I'm actually allowing have happen is what Emerson actually has done, which is they've taken behavior and let it inform the sort of content that they want to present to their users. So this is a good example of where responsive design wasn't appropriate, and the authors of this website, I believe, made the right decision. So what is its importance? Well, traditional design requires HTML and CSS by device. So for a widescreen monitor, I've got files. For a tablet, I have different files. For a laptop, separate. Again, you get the drift here. Mobile, I've got even separate. But with responsive design, what I'm allowed to do is I'm allowed to set up one HTML, one CSS file, and then based on the responsiveness of those two files, I can actually render the same site with the same content across all the devices. So it has impacts. And the impacts are on all different levels of our industry. It impacts business opportunity. Responsive design can be more expensive to do, and it can also take a lot more thought in terms of prioritizing content and business needs against user needs. It impacts development approach. Generally takes a little bit longer to develop in responsive design than it would if you just did straight HTML and CSS across different devices. It can impact design approach. Certainly, you're not going to arrange things the same way on a desktop than you would on a mobile device. So allowing that to scale elegantly is both the double-edged sword of responsive design. And it impacts testing. Information architecture and user experience are both heavily impacted by this idea. So how should it be used? Well, let's take a couple examples and let's run it through some business goals and needs and figure out what the right approach was. This is a nonprofit organization called NicheQ. It's a children's healthcare quality organization. And this site, although it does have some gated content, is by and large a brochure website. It's informational in nature. It's giving a lot of information to its users. And the user, because we know it's a sort of a niche organization in the nonprofit world, the user is likely going to have a high level of interest in this website, whether they're coming here on a mobile device or whether they're coming here on a desktop. So for this particular example, responsive design is probably appropriate. It would be a good way to repurpose the same code base. It'd be easier to manage for the end user or the content editor if it's built on a CMS. And for the user on the device, you're going to get the same information. And because you probably have a high level of interest when you come to this website, you're not going to mind having a couple of clicks involved, even on a mobile experience. But let's take something like a credit card website or like Capital One pre-qualification form on their website. This is an example of something that, well, there's obviously security around this, and so having this just scaled down from a design perspective may jar the user a little bit. It also has multiple levels of the form. You fill out some pieces, then you go to the next step and fill out others. And for that to scale down to a mobile experience and require all the same information from the user as you do on the desktop might be unrealistic. And so for those reasons and probably a litany of others, responsive design for something as sort of mission critical, business centric, and from a user experience standpoint, responsive web design may not be appropriate for something like a credit card website. So what are the benefits? Well, you get a single code base. You get better performance because you're able to cache the same code base across all devices. It's simplified content management. You don't necessarily have to worry about the hierarchy of the content from a CMS standpoint. The design is taking care of that, so you simply just populate the same data fields over time. It's a smaller CMS human resource team. What we mean by that is you don't necessarily have to have a huge team, one to manage mobile, one to manage desktop, one to manage tablet, if your business is able to take the benefits of responsive web design. Could be a smaller team that's actually managing the content. And finally, sort of an intangible, is that it forces a core value assessment. Oftentimes, responsive web design is starting from mobile up instead of desktop down. And what that does is it forces the business, along with its interactive, agency or internal team, to decipher and rank the hierarchy of their content and their business objectives much more cleanly than if they have all of the real estate of a desktop resolution. Of course, there's drawbacks, right? Well, it ignores device behavior intent. What I mean by that is, take it to a different device. If you needed to make a 2-hour conference call, the conference call phone, the boardroom phone is appropriate, right? But you wouldn't want to take that same phone with you in the mall to try to catch up with friends or family. You want the right device to match the behavior. The other thing is that the design scales and the content does it. And that seems maybe counterintuitive. Wouldn't the content and the design be together? But take an offline example. If I go into my doctor's office and have one experience with magazines and friendly receptionist and waiting room, and then I go to a hospital and I don't see the same thing. I mean, from a content perspective, they're the same idea. I'm going to both my doctor's office and the hospital for medical care. But the behavior, the intended behavior, and the expectation of the user is different in both of those scenarios. So we shouldn't underestimate that the device is indicating an expectation from the user, and from a business standpoint, it's our responsibility to meet that as closely as we can. And the last is that it's business-centric and not user-centric. And so I started thinking about an example for this one that was non-interactive. I thought of Las Vegas, actually. Business in Vegas is about essentially taking money from gamblers or from customers. If we just got off the plane in Vegas and handed over our cash and got back on a plane and came home, that would be business-centric, right? They wouldn't mind, but it wouldn't be user-centric. So Vegas is a good example of providing a user experience that allows the business to achieve its goals while giving the user the same idea. So where are we going? Well, just about every person within interactive spaces is decreeing that users are going to be accessing the web via mobile more than the desktop as soon as within 2013. This graph has it at 2015, and this is a few years old, and this one is probably late. With that in mind, we're already seeing a trend where mobile is affecting all other presentations, perhaps a byproduct of responsive design, but not its original intention. And you don't have to look much further than major operating systems to be able to see that there's clearly a mobile-driven concept moving design and user experience from the bottom up. So what that indicates to me is that we should be starting small and begin scaling up and not scaling down. But of course, what does that mean? Well, let's take a couple examples. This is an operating system you're probably familiar with. This is the iOS operating system. This came out a number of years ago with the first release of the iPhone. Well, this is Lion that came out a few years ago, and Mountain Lion is now out. You can see how the mobile interface for the operating system is now very clearly impacting the way the desktop experience is being rendered as well. But you might say, those of you that know me are going to call me Mac crazy, right? I'm a big Apple fan, so maybe that's not just a fair single example. Let's take a look at another one. This is the Windows operating system. Again, very icon-driven, very simple to understand. And just this year, Windows 8 came out. You can see how the design, the user experience from the mobile device is very clearly and prominently impacting the way that the desktop and sometimes even tablet devices are being rendered. Well, little reference to a YouTube craze. I'm not crazy. Let's take a look at one more. This is a Google Android operating system. And for those of you that may actually be running Chrome, this will look familiar. This is the Chrome operating system. You can see a very clear alignment between the mobile experiencing driving up the experience to the desktop machines. So what is my personal stance? Well, it really has to be a case-by-case basis. There's no silver bullet interactive. You should be suspicious of anyone who says that responsive design is the absolute answer. It's not. It's quickly becoming the religious debate of the day, much like .NET and PHP were a number of years ago. Just like you wouldn't tell a neighborhood watch group to go buy an expensive content management system to manage the content on their neighborhood blog, you wouldn't necessarily tell American Express to move their principal digital asset to responsive design. If this were a black and white issue, clients wouldn't need us as agencies to help them understand where they are within the landscape and what's going to be most appropriate for them and their business needs. If they're coming to us with responsive design as a solution, I think that we should be welcoming the dialogue and use this as an opportunity to dive deeper into their business and to help them solve their problems, but always realizing that responsive web design is a tool. It's not necessarily the answer. So with that, there's comments at the bottom of this post. Appreciate any feedback, any thoughts you guys have, and thanks for taking a few minutes with me.